Okay, let's get started. Welcome back to the Special Education Point of Contact webinar. I'm Victoria Glick, Deputy Assistant Superintendent within the K-12 Division of Systems and Supports at OSSE. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please look out for a series invitation following this session for the 2020 summer and following school year. Special Education Point of Contact webinars, including monthly topics that are related to data systems, monitoring and compliance, results-driven accountability, recovery plan and implementation, and OSSE policy and guidance. OSSE has been working across the education sector very recently to deploy guidance and best practice information to inform LEA recovery efforts. In our May 6th webinar that you might have attended, OSSE set a foundation for this work in consultation with our LEA partners engaged in the Deputy Mayor for Education Working Group on special education. So some of the information that will be coming to you this summer in various formats should be very familiar. If you attended the May 6th webinar, we'll be expanding on that work. Today, we have some special guests with us here to present to you on LEA developed and deployed actionable tools for recovery planning and implementation. OSSE is very pleased to host this session. These tools are based on OSSE's framework for recovery planning, but are developed for and by LEAs. We hope that you will also attend the summer training series that we'll talk about at the end of the session to support your work. And we hope that the tools and guidance discussed today, developed for and by LEAs, will be helpful in supporting those efforts also. After all of our guests speak, I will wrap up with some quick reminders about the upcoming OSSE events for the summer designed to facilitate your work as it relates to the recovery implementation. I'll now hand it off to our guests to introduce themselves and begin their presentation.
Thanks, Victoria. Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Camarata, and I work with the DC Special Education Cooperative. We are so grateful to OSSE for allowing us to present this work that we've been doing over the past few weeks. The LEA representatives and other team members will introduce themselves as they present. But I just wanted to kick off by saying that please feel free to use the chat as they're presenting. We'll be monitoring it and can answer questions as we go. And that we are kind of here for you beyond this. So if you have questions after you've had time to digest some of this and want to reach out to myself or any one of the presenters, please do. I think we're all figuring this out together, and so the more engagement we can get around this, the more minds around the table, the better for all of us and for our students. So with that, I'll hand it over to Amita.
Thanks, Julie. Good morning, everybody. My name is Amita Latigar, and I'm the Director of Inclusion at Creative Minds International Public Charter School. So I'm just going to kick us off with some conversation around what's in it for us as LEAs to think through recovery of learning and compensatory services. So as we're planning our school's recovery plan, it's really important for us to be considering the needs of all students and that the plan is responsive to all the kids in the school, not just our kids in the general education program, but really meeting the needs of all kids. In our work in special ed, I think many of us have sort of learned through this time that it's really been crucial to implement IEPs to the extent possible and partner with our school's leadership team to really make sure that we're addressing all student needs. And so what's nice about this process, once you undertake it, is it's a really beautiful opportunity for all sides of the school to really work together. In addition, our intent in doing all of this work to help guide you all in this planning is to potentially reduce litigation There have been some conversations, I think many of us have been a part of, where parents are thinking about compensatory services already. And so for us to consider this as guidance for you is just an opportunity for us to be prepared for those conversations with families. And to that vein, it really helps us build relationships with families when we have documents and guidance to ground conversations in, and data to support our thinking as a school when we think about recovery for kids and compensation. And then in terms of resources, it hopefully will help us save resources because we're planning ahead of time and thinking through all school recovery at the same time. And if we think about our kids who will potentially be transferring LEAs during this time, which is, I think, a likelihood for a lot of us, the more we do this planning for each other, the better we will be able to collaborate across the city, which is, I think, just a beautiful opportunity again for us to be cohesive around something that's really important for all kids. Next slide.
Hi, this is Lauren Baum. I'm an attorney that represents a number of charter schools in DC, and got the privilege of working with this group to come up with some of these ideas and guidance. So we wanted to talk to you a little bit about our kind of rationale for what we're sharing with you today, which ultimately is going to be a tool that we hope schools can use to make individualized compensatory education determinations. But as you all know, during this distance learning period, which we are defining as, March 2020 to July 2020, basically the period once schools close to the end of ESY for those students who qualify for ESY. Next school year, while it may include some distance learning, seems a little bit different and may warrant a different approach, and we'll kind of all figure that out as we go, I guess. But for this distance learning period, as you all know, LEAs were responsible for providing basically special education services and distance learning services individualized to students with disabilities that were designed to implement IEPs to the greatest extent possible and to enable students to access the general education distance learning program. And so that was kind of the starting point. And then based on the U.S. Department of Education's guidance and OSSE guidance, we know that the expectation is that when we conclude distance learning and kind of resume normal, quote unquote, normal operations, which, will not necessarily still be normal, that at some point we're also expected to make individualized determinations for those students with disabilities as to whether compensatory education services are needed to make up for any skills that have been lost due to the kind of distance learning time. OSSE, in its most recent guidance, took it a step further and making it clear that LEAs are responsible for ensuring that services designed to mitigate that regression and address any, lost learning recovery needs to occur first for all students. And so we're going to start, there in this conversation. And then going above and beyond that, students with disabilities will need additional considerations made for whether anything else is needed for them in terms of compensatory education. So our hope is that school-wide recovery planning and services, available to all students will mitigate the need for individualized compensatory education for students with disabilities. But we also know that no matter what you do, the IEP team for each of those students at your LEA is going to have to meet and make those individualized decisions. And so, I think it's important to point out that compensatory education isn't typically used in this fashion. And the IDEA is frankly silent on compensatory education. It's really a construct that comes out of litigation when schools, don't do what they're supposed to do. And in this case, we're not necessarily talking about a situation where schools or LEAs didn't do what they were supposed to do, but rather, couldn't fully do what the IEP contemplated due to the school's closure. And so needing to basically come up with a framework for how to make those decisions, given that we're kind of using compensatory education in a way that we've never seen before. So that's kind of our thought process, and I'll turn it over to whoever's doing the next slide.
So Lauren, did you want to speak a little bit more about this slide here, or
Oh,
did
yeah,
you want
that one of mine too, sorry.
No, that's okay.
I've been very busy the last 3 days. Yeah, so we want to distinguish, compensatory education services versus recovery services. I guess the first point is that IDA doesn't specifically address either, but the way we're looking at it, and I think the way the guidance looks at it, particularly as OSSE has delineated it, is that recovery services and recovery planning is something that we're doing for everybody, whether they have a disability or not. We know that we need to pay very close attention to how students benefited from or maybe did not benefit from fully our distance learning programming, and we need to ensure that we are providing services to address recovery of that lost learning for everybody. So that's kind of the starting point. And then compensatory education, like I said, is kind of an additional layer for students with disabilities who might, based on their own individual needs and circumstances, need more to address, whatever impact school closures and distance learning had on them. And so we've highlighted here, we have some links to the guidance that is relevant. So the U.S. Department of Education guidance is linked there. The OSSE guidance is linked there separately. And then at the bottom of the Compensatory Education Services column, you'll see a link to kind of a guidance roundup, kind of what all the guidance says, put into one place related to compensatory education. What the guidance says is, first and foremost, we should be providing compensatory education to address skills that might have been lost, so regression. But then it also kind of, the Department of Education's guidance kind of uses this, vague, consistent with applicable requirements language. Well, there aren't kind of clear applicable requirements for this situation. What we do know in DC is that federal courts have kind of established this general framework that says compensatory education services are intended to put the child in the position that he or she would have been in had the services been provided in the first place. So you'll see later when we get to the worksheet that we created, we're basically going to be doing a qualitative analysis of, what did the student receive during distance learning? What sort of progress did they make, and how does that progress compare to the progress that we saw from all of our students? Did we see any regression, and how does that compare to regression seen by all students? And then we kind of use all of that to determine, what, if anything, beyond the general education recovery plan do we need to provide to individual students with disabilities. And I think it's really important to point out to you all, and for you all to be thinking about as you're having these conversations with parents, that compensatory education under no circumstances requires making up services hour for hour. So it's not, you were supposed to get X hours, you got Y, we have to do the, subtract and, make up the difference. It's more qualitative than that, which is why we try to create some tools to help make that decision.
All right, I think we can go to the next slide. Awesome. So hi everyone, my name is Melody Maitland. I'm the Director of Student Support Services at DC International School. In terms of framing, and I think Lauren really spoke to a lot of this, OSSE had a webinar entitled Serving Students with Disabilities During Periods of Remote or Blended Learning on May 20th. And in that webinar, various tools and considerations were offered so that you can ensure that you have high quality distance learning programming. An important framing during that presentation, and one that our recovery approach aligns with, is taking a tiered approach to supporting students' recovery of learning. So if you wanted to learn more about this specific webinar and the framing that we use and the materials that you're going to see, Jennifer Carpenter will discuss specific trainings around the 3 key principles that OSSE has discussed and laid out in that very comprehensive webinar that was done on May 20th. I'll turn it over to Amita to discuss the specific tiered approach we've taken with crafting these tools for recovery.
Thanks, Melody. So we sort of took that great tiered triangle that OSSE created and tried to make it a little bit clearer for us as we thought through these tools. And so when we think about the bottom or the foundation of the tiers, the first tier is, as I talked about before, recovery planning for all students. So you're thinking through what's going to be beneficial for all of your kids as they return to any form of learning in the fall, whether it be distance only, a blend of distance and in person. You want to think through, and we thought through, okay, what can we provide schools with in terms of guidance around the tier 3 by showing that tier 1 and tier 2 build towards tier 3. So your first tier, again, you're planning for all of your kids. Then the second tier is informed by the data that's collected through distance learning and potentially through tier 1, where you figure out what small supports you can provide in addition for students. And keep in mind, again, you're thinking through all of your kids. At the same time, special ed services are running, right? So, and you're taking that information to then also identify what additional support at the third tier you'll need to provide your students with compensatory services if you found during distance learning that students regressed through data collection, that in some cases they didn't participate at all, or they participated so intermittently that it was clear that there was a loss of skills. So this is, imagine a flexible sort of approach. You're thinking through all the tiers at the same time, and it's not easy, and it's a big undertaking for us as schools to think through all of this. So when we were, as a group, really talking about how we were going to attack this very big monster, we were all really excited about the opportunity to think through these things together and also think through them for our city so that we can be clear on what we think is best for kids. So I'm going to hand it over to Megan, who is going to talk to the next slide.
Amita, can you unmute Megan?
Bear with us, folks. We're going to address this technical issue.
Megan, you should be unmuted.
I'll go ahead and jump in here, and when we can hear Megan, she'll step in. We collaboratively developed this process, so I will try to share the thoughts I know she was trying to convey. So the first step, these tiers 1 and 2, the bottom of our triangle, are actually recovery services for all students. And so it says here guiding questions for special education leaders, since we knew that would be the bulk of our audience today. But these are really questions for school leadership as well. And so if you are a general education leader or whole school leader, intervention leader, these are some things to think about. Really, we need to start at the ground floor of what is the recovery plan for the whole school. Your special education leaders are already getting questions from families. What's my comp ed going to be? What's the compensatory education going to look like? What's going to be individualized for my child? And we can't answer those questions until tiers 1 and 2 are developed. So looking at, does your school have an MTSS process already, or an SST and RTI program? That could be your vehicle to address recovery. It doesn't necessarily have to be our MTSS does this, and here's our COVID recovery plan over here. Similarly, if you don't yet have an MTSS program, this is a fantastic opportunity to start to build one. OSSE has a number of resources, and there are great resources out there to get an MTSS up and running. So asking yourselves, what are our tiers of supports? How will students be placed into those tiers? What does beginning of the year data collection look like? And again, that's not necessarily just academically, but also when we're looking at social, emotional, behavioral, and trauma, and making sure that children have the appropriate supports at tiers 1, 2, and 3. A big question for all schools is going to be, who's responsible for making these decisions and managing this process? Who owns tiers 1 and 2 at your school? Because again, tier 3 is supposed to be a supplement to that. It's not supposed to replace it. And so in order to start to think about compensatory education and recovery, you have to know what's being offered at tiers 1 and 2, which means there has to be at least one, if not several, identified owners of tiers 1 and 2 at your LEA. How will your LEA use data to determine the need for and assess the effectiveness of recovery? Is this going to be a one-time event where at the beginning of the year, students are placed into their tiers and the program moves on? How frequently are you going to come back and assess? And again, that might be a system that's already embedded into your MTSS process, or that might be something that you need to develop. But again, keeping in mind that recovery will not be a special education specific endeavor, and it won't be a general education specific endeavor. They really will correlate with each other. And then one thing to start thinking about, when should our LEA make compensatory education decisions? This is a key component for people. We want to keep in mind that there is not yet a time frame during which these decisions have to be made. And so your LEA can choose to implement recovery prior to making these decisions. Similarly, if you have a child who you know is going out of state, or you know is going to another LEA, and your team really wants a say in what those services look like, you might decide to make that decision sooner, keeping in mind that under the new guidance, whichever IEP team makes the compensatory education decision is the one that's responsible for implementing the compensatory education decision. So starting to talk with your LEAs about, when do we think we'll have enough information to have these conversations? And one other thing we'd throw in there is making sure that you're communicating with families throughout this process, because again, compensatory education in this context is new for us, which means it's new for our families too. And they might have questions around, when's that speech going to get made up? When's PT going to start? Those sorts of things. So whatever your school decides, communicating consistently and effectively with families. We can move on to the next slide. This may have been Megan also, so if someone else is welcome to jump in. Essentially, when you get to that third tier of, we know what all our kids are getting, we know what our small groups of kids are getting, and this specific kid's needs are not going to be met. We cannot project that they will be met by our whole school recovery plan. Your individualized recovery plan is your compensatory services. So look at a qualitative analysis of what the student received through distance learning, both with respect to the general education distance learning program and special education services or accommodations and supports. What progress or regression did the student experience as a result? And what's needed to address recovery of lost learning and mitigate student regression? So one thing to keep in mind, one thing that's not in these considerations is whether or not the student chose to or consistently participated in distance learning. The reason why a student was unavailable or didn't necessarily get the educational benefit is not a strong consideration here, because, for example, if you had a family that you offered the sun, moon, and stars to, but they were not able to take advantage of it, that student wasn't able to access the educational benefit of their program. And so keeping in mind that compensatory services should really be a data-driven analytical decision and not necessarily based on, well, here's what we offered or here's why it wasn't accepted, taken advantage of, etc. Some other considerations, different compensatory education services may be necessary for students moving between LEAs, students whose eligibility was delayed due to closure. So we saw that question in the chat, and I encourage you guys to continue using the question feature. We are still answering those. So yes, if a student's eligibility was delayed due to the closure, they're subsequently found eligible, that is likely a compensatory education decision. There are ways to mitigate that as far as putting in individualized learning plans or support plans for students in place. And again, this is a place where family communication is likely going to be the strongest factor in forging us forward. So once you get to individualized recovery planning, that's your compensatory services. Also keeping in mind that this is where related services fits in as well, because in all likelihood, speech, OT, PT, audiology, those are not going to be robust components of a whole school recovery plan, although some of them may need to be involved. That being said, so those are the kinds of things that you might still be fielding into a compensatory services plan if a student didn't have access to PT or didn't benefit from OT in the virtual model, they didn't necessarily make the expected progress, or they demonstrated regression in that area. Compensatory services would then be included in their individualized recovery plan.
This is Lauren. I just want to jump in on a couple points, if that's okay. Samantha kind of did address some of the questions that came in. One regarding, if a student's evaluation was delayed, do we need to be having conversations about compensatory education? And she said yes, which is right. I think the framework for making those decisions is not necessarily going to be the same as what we're talking about now. So I don't know that the worksheet that we have for this conversation is necessarily going to plug in exactly right for that conversation, but it is definitely something teams are going to need to look at and again make qualitative decisions around. And then I just wanted to clarify one thing. I mean, I think in terms of missed services due to students not being available or not taking advantage of the services, it is a consideration. It's not the primary consideration, but when we walk through the worksheet later and the guidance that we've provided around the worksheet, you'll see that it is there. Again, because this is a qualitative analysis, it's not an easy formula. It's one of many factors that would need to be considered, but I do think it is a factor to consider, albeit maybe not the most important factor.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that clarification, Lauren. And I see there were some questions related to these matters. So for example, like what compensatory education should be considered for those students who didn't participate in remote learning? I would imagine that at several LEAs, if not most of them, students who didn't participate at all in remote learning is not confined to the special ed population. So that's another place where this goes back into what are your tier 1 and 2 plans for students who didn't participate and demonstrate a certain level of regression as a result of that decision. And then your special education students who are in that boat, you'll make that compensatory decision based on what's available in tiers 1 and 2. We can go to the next slide.
All right, I hope this is the moment you've been waiting for. You're like, yes, I know the tiers, all the things I have to consider, but like, how do I do it? How can I actually have each of those individual meetings? So our working group has created 2 tools to support LEAs with recovery planning. The first is a worksheet to guide your individual recovery and compensatory service conversations with each student. In the training materials email that you received, you have the PDF if you want to follow along. It's a pretty dense document, and so the purpose of me is not to go through every component, but just to give you some background on how we developed this tool. So we started with using the formatting of similar worksheets and sets so that the formatting does not distract teams from the actual content. You'll see that the worksheet mirrors the ESY worksheet very closely. In that sheet, we've identified 3 criteria that encompasses all the tiers of recovery you need to consider, as Samantha just reviewed when making these decisions. And those 3 components are the services that all students and the individual student received during distance learning, the progress the individual student made during distance learning, and very critically, that progress in comparison to progress of all students, and then the regression the individual student may have experienced during distance learning as compared to general education peers. These conversations will guide you through determining if the student requires compensatory education services, so those tier 3 services. If you've determined eligibility, then you go to the second part of the worksheet and detail the specific recovery plan. noting what recovery looks like for this student at each tier of recovery. And we know that this worksheet is dense, and that's why we've spent many weeks talking through it and looking at guidance and having great conversations to pare it down to the most important components. So someone is scrolling through. Like I said, it's a very dense document, and we recognize that. So we've developed a complementary guidance tool, which explains each section in depth. And I'm going to hand it over to Samantha to discuss that guidance tool.
Sure. Thank you so much, Melody. And we can actually put the worksheet back up while I go through the guidance document, because I think that's what people are interested in seeing, is like, what is this worksheet? So I'll walk you through the guidance that we'll have available. And again, these are partner documents to help you answer these questions. So looking at criterion 1, that's the school level data on services that were provided during the COVID-19 distance learning period. So that's your opportunity. We have some probes and guiding questions there, but that's your opportunity to detail services and supports that were available, both through the general education distance learning program and special education related services, accommodations, and supports that were provided. Thinking of this worksheet, we actually do envision as an outward facing document. Parents will contribute to this discussion. It could be available to attorneys and advocates. So this is where you're putting, here's what we offered, here's what we made available, here's when our services began, here's any delay, here's accommodations put in place. Whereas the guidance document is your internal team document to better understand these criteria. If there were some services that couldn't be provided remotely, then the team would include that information here as well. And the team should consider whether students received the full amount of services. So for example, if you were doing 30 minutes of speech every single week consistently, but the student had 60 minutes per week of speech on the IEP, those are the sorts of considerations we're thinking about in criterion 1. It doesn't necessarily mean that compensatory education will be warranted. It just means that there's kind of a presumption that that discussion will occur. In criterion 2, that's the school level data on progress that was experienced by all students, which is why it's exceptionally important to partner with your general education and your leadership or administrative team on how did all students do. Special education can't live in a silo here where we have a lot of data on IEP goals or how our students progressed. This is really going to be a consideration of how did students progress in light of the circumstances, which means we need the whole school data for progress and regression. Then you're looking at what progress did that individual student make and how does that individual student's progress compare to all students. So one important question to answer with your leadership team that you'll see on the guidance document is what progress was expected for all students. If your school has not yet decided, our program was designed for maintenance, our program was designed for a full 3 months of growth, our program was designed for modified growth. We expected students to make about 1.5 months in the 3 months of distance learning. That's the first question that has to be answered. And then you can start to answer, so what progress then could we reasonably expect for an individual student with disabilities given his or her individual circumstances? So this will include standardized assessment data as well as your qualitative analysis for progress toward IEP goals as well as the general education relative progress. In criterion 3, that's your school level data on regression experienced by all students. And so again, this, you can see now 2 criteria in a special education worksheet are heavily dependent on general education data. And so we want to be looking at, was some level of regression experienced by all students? Was regression experienced by this specific student? And then assess the data, standardized assessment data and progress toward IEP goals. It's important to have reliable data here. So I know that some schools have worried that assessments that were completed at home during this time may not necessarily be the most accurate view of student progress. That's why, you know, one of our big takeaways is take your time then in making these decisions when you get back, when students get back into the building, robustly assess to the extent that you can, while of course taking into account social emotional needs of families and children, but make sure that you have the information you need. As far as documenting the recovery plan and compensatory education, that's what you'll see at the bottom of the worksheet. So there's like kind of this, it all comes down to, just like it does for ESY or transportation, At the end of the day, after we encompass all of the tier 1 and 2 supports, the recovery and interventions that are going to be available at that level, does the student require additional services beyond what's available through the school's Gen Ed recovery plan? And if that answer is yes, you'd explain the team's rationale and you detail the recovery or compensatory education here. One thing to note is that this is a projection, it's not a guarantee. Like any comp ed plan, we can't necessarily say, well, once we give that 12 hours, then he or she is going to be right back where we wanted them to be. So making sure that you consistently revisit student progress, maybe even more so than you have usually in your regular practice, and then continue to adjust student programming. Our recommendation would be through the IEP amendment process, that if you put in the time for compensatory education that you expected would make growth, and then that student is going to need longer term support, making sure you're revisiting their program within the OSSE guidelines around IEP development and IEP amendment. So we assume there will be some questions here, but that is essentially the worksheet. And again, there's a detailed guidance document that goes along with it for you to know kind of what goes into each section.
I'm just looking at the questions now. We tried to answer some of them, but just so everybody knows what the answers were. One question was, should this document be completed for all students? And the answer is yes. This is a document that you would use to guide decision making, those individualized decisions, and then fill this out and upload it into SEDS for each individual student, if you choose to use this document, obviously. And then there was a question about guidance on how to maneuver on criterion 1. The accompanying guidance document offers a lot of detail about how you might answer some of these questions and what the answers might mean in terms of consideration. So hopefully that's helpful. If it's not, let us know. We can certainly try to answer any other questions you have.
Yeah, so for Julie's question, thanks for clarifying there. So no, we're not saying amend IEPs to add the compensatory services, although I'm sure increased services on the IEP is one model a team could choose. We're saying after compensatory services are delivered, right? If a team agrees to time bound 12 hours of this, 240 minutes of speech, we're just saying don't let it stop there. The progress monitoring should continue to make sure that the hoped for or expected outcome was reached, but the actual compensatory services do not necessarily have to be incorporated into the IEP if that's not the team's decision. As far as the FAPE question is saying,
can I jump in on that last question real quick, Samantha?
Sure. Yep.
You'll see in the guidance document and in OSSE's guidance that, OSSE kind of highlights that there's several ways that compensatory education services could be provided, one of which is amending the IEP to increase services for some time limited amount of time. So it's certainly one way to do it, but you don't have to do it that way. And we try to at least state what OSSE's guidance is in our guidance document.
Yeah, I mean, Lauren, I'm sure you'll want to jump in on the other question too, which is saying that a student does require comp services admission of a denial of FAPE.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the tricky part about using the notion of compensatory education services for these conversations, because compensatory education is typically seen as a remedy when a school fails to do something it's supposed to do under IDEA, and that results in a denial of FAPE for the student. So I think we try very hard in the worksheet to kind of lay out why we're making this determination. So I would not, now, not to say that some parent's attorney might not try to make it an admission, but I would, feel like there's a very reasonable argument to be made that we're not saying that this is a denial of FAPE. We're saying that the student missed services just like everybody else due to the school closure, and we're trying to figure out how to, remediate any loss that resulted. At the end of the day, whether it's a denial of FAPE or not, if we're being proactive and making these decisions about how to get kids back on track, I'm kind of less concerned about it. But, we're here because the Department of Education has told us this is what we have to do. So we don't really have a choice in the matter.
I think Amita will take us through the next slide.
Yes, gladly. So in terms of next steps for us as LEAs, We highly recommend you guys meet with your leadership teams to talk through what the whole school recovery plan is going to look like for all students. At the same time, you want to look at the end of year data that was collected from progress monitoring, whether it be iReady for the whole school or any other tools that you all used. Knowing that the data might not be the most accurate representation of student ability, given it was taken during distance learning, but at least we have somewhere we can sort of ground the conversation in. And if you haven't already, we also recommend that you complete the FAPE worksheet that we rolled out during a PCSB webinar, I want to say back in May. And in this planning process, you want to think about how are you going to monitor and document the students' progress, as well as what you're going to communicate to your families and the rest of your team around how recovery services will play out, how long recovery services will last, what student progress should look like, how you're going to monitor it, how flexibly you're going to move students through tiers to ensure growth. But by and large, the biggest piece is that special ed should be a strong component of recovery planning for the whole school.
There's a few other questions that have come in. I don't know if it'd be helpful to answer them now before we talk about OSSE resources.
Yeah, sure. That sounds great.
So a couple questions about kind of timeline. When should we be doing this? There's no kind of bright line rule. I mean, we certainly think, or at least I think, I guess I won't speak for everybody. I think that, you know, we really can't begin to make the individualized compensatory education determinations until one, we know what the kind of tier 1 and 2 recovery plan is going to look like at each school or at your given LEA. And 2, we have you know, whole school or whole grade data for everybody, in addition to good data for the individual student with a disability. So it's, I don't think the expectation is that you're able to make these decisions, you know, before the school year starts or even right at the beginning of the school year. It may take some time. One question related to that was, you know, would it make sense to see how recovery goes for all students before making those individualized determinations? I think that's certainly one way to go. If you feel like, you know, that's the best path for your LEA. If another LEA felt like they had enough information to, you know, make those decisions as that recovery was happening or before it was completed, that would be fine too. It's all about making sure the team has the information that it needs to make a decision that is reasonably calculated, you know, to ensure that the student recovers that lost learning. And then
if I can jump in on that one, Lauren, just to kind of weave together again, and I know I'm harping on it, but the SST, the interplay here between your multi-tiered system of supports, we have, you know, I have a phenomenal intervention team, and they have their kind of usual practice of we collect data, and maybe late September, early October, we're moving kids into tiers and developing plans. And then in winter, we're reviewing that again. So your school could say, well, it's in that first kind of round that we're going to start to talk about comp ed. September, October, we'll have data on all kids. Your school could say, we're going to implement recovery. And in that second round of MTSS meetings, that's when we're going to talk about comp ed. There's, you know, there is no necessary guideline, but again, wanting to make sure people know this isn't a SPED specific determination. It can be a holistic approach to how are we helping all students to recover this process from this situation, and then what do our students with disabilities need specifically, but trying to keep in mind that you don't need to necessarily say, well, here's our MTSS process and our comp ed deadlines over here. These can be integrated practices, whereas you're assessing progress for all students, you're determining at what juncture do you kind of peel off and make a comp ed determination as well.
Yeah, and I think you have that discretion as the LEA to figure out when the best time to do that is. There was a question that's not specifically recovery and comp ed related, but I think it might be worth just touching on briefly. As a working group, we've kind of talked about it briefly and informally, but the question was for next school year, given that lots of schools are going to have, you know, potentially a blended model or some other model of their school year that's not, you know, what we would be doing if there weren't a global pandemic. does it make sense to amend IEPs now to reflect, you know, the new structures of the school year? I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think what's going to be happening next school year is different than this kind of unexpected and sudden closure for the end of this past school year. And I think now is the time to, if you know that your school year is going to look different for some period of time or for the entire school year, I think now is the time to, you know, make the IEP kind of reflect what's actually happening rather than continuing with this, you know, we're doing the best we can type of structure. But people can feel free to disagree with me on this panel. Another question that just came in, does the worksheet need to be completed within an MDT meeting? I mean, the guidance from the Department of Education and kind of reiterated by OSSE is that the IEP team needs to make these decisions. So the short answer to that is yes. Now, there are situations where, you know, we're able to kind of confer with parents and agree on things without meetings. So perhaps in some instances you might be able to get away with that. But the, you know, general idea is that these are IEP team decisions. Somebody asked, what if we don't have end of year data? I mean, obviously you got to use what you have. If, you know, there should be some hopefully end of year data, if nothing else, for IEP progress report monitoring for individual students with disabilities. If you're concerned that you don't have end of year data kind of school-wide because you didn't administer your typical, you know, school-wide assessments, then I think you rely on the data you had, you know, before schools closed and the data you can collect, you know, once kind of school resumes in whatever way it's going to resume for you in the fall. I don't know if I've missed any other ones or if other folks have things to say.
Hi there, Lauren. This is Victoria. I think we've answered most of the questions in the question box. Thank you, participants, for submitting those. I hope that Q&A portion here was very helpful. Up on your screen are the OSSE resources. If any of our guest speakers would like to touch on those, I welcome you to do so.
Hi, this is Jennifer Carpenter, and I just want to remind those of you who are on today that there will be a technical assistance session this afternoon from 1:30 to 3 o'clock. We will be, and it's the first time it'll be offered again end of July, beginning of August, but we will be talking about some tools that you can use to collect the information that we've just been discussing that you will need to make decisions about your students. And so these things fit together. I dropped a link in the chat to a website, a web page on OSSE's website that holds a lot of the tools that we'll be discussing. There's a list here, a sample student data tool, service adaptation worksheets, accommodations materials, and promising practice resource matrix. For those of you that attended our webinar on May 20th, you know that these tools all work together to help you customize a data collection suite for your LEA. Even if you are very pleased with your mechanisms of data collection, none of us were ready to collect data quite this way to answer exactly these questions that we're facing now and will be facing as students transition back to school in whatever form and perhaps back home again. Who knows? And so I really hope that you'll take a look at these tools. If you have not had a chance to sign up for the technical assistance sessions, please do so. They're going to be offered again throughout the year. And like I said, these things all work together. In fact, when I do my webinar this afternoon, ladies on the panel, I'm going to be adding your resources to the resources I already have to share with folks. So just a pre-warning there. I think we're good for the next slide.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Jen. So this is Victoria. We just want to give you some brief reminders and announcements about upcoming OSSE events and professional development. So we'll run through those. I want to thank our guests today for joining us and providing such critical information and resources. We will ensure that the resources, this presentation is posted on the OSSE website, and also that folks receive a copy of the materials today, including links to the worksheet and guidance document, so that you all can embark on this work with this tool in hand. Jen will speak a little bit more about her training here, and then I'll give you some information about teaching and learning's other professional development work and some data systems trainings that are available as you begin to work on what's next in the next school year.
Sure, thanks, Victoria. So as I mentioned, we offered a 2-hour webinar, and 2 hours was not quite enough to cover the number of tools that we had created. And so we have opportunities to do the deep dive, and one of the next slides we can talk about that. But I do want to tell you, the webinar is linked here on this slide. And so if you have a chance, if you didn't get to attend, to view the webinar before attending the technical assistance sessions, it's a good idea. Then you'll be starting at the same point as some of the other attendees, and you'll have a better idea of what we're going to be doing before we dig in and get our hands in there and start using these tools to make the sorts of decisions that you discussed today. Here is some information about the technical assistance series, the dates that things will be offered and what we'll be focusing on in each session. You'll have access to the slide later, so check it out. But I will say this, if you would like to register for the session, you see there's that registration app link in the bottom. Don't use it. That link's a pain. I will send everybody, through your follow-up email, a better way to register for these sessions that you'll find less of a headache. So don't use that link. Don't worry, better links are coming in your follow-up email.
Okay, thank you, Jen. So this slide is just a quick reminder about the summer 2020 professional development. Our teaching and learning division at OSSE is hosting over 50 sessions, a virtual PD this summer. Please view the list at the link here. You can subscribe to receive information about those. And you can register using the OSSE training registration app here. For questions, please click on this link and it'll take you to a list of the appropriate teaching and learning professional development team members to ask questions. We also have upcoming use of the early access to incoming student data tools for schools. Some trainings have been rolled out on this work, and the pre-recorded trainings are available on the website at these links. The purpose of all of these apps is so that your LEA can view students who are pre-enrolled in your LEA but not quite yet attending, so that you can plan effectively to serve these student populations. This is that early access information that was discussed in last year's start of school work, and will be threaded throughout our start of school work this year. Also available on the OSSE website are several SEDS trainings and resources. Getting started with SEDS, navigating the initial eligibility process in SEDS, and the SEDS basic user guide. We want to make sure that you have this information available on a routine basis to access and utilize as you're pulling together your student data. And that completes our announcements. I want to thank everyone for attending today and giving us your time and attention. We truly appreciate it. We know that time is scarce these days. It is quite the commodity. And we've included here contact information for specific folks at OSSE to answer your questions. And we encourage you to ask us questions as you are working through this. We're working to ensure that we circle back with helpful answers quickly. Thank you again for attending, and thank you to our guest presenters today for sharing all of your knowledge and experience with our LEAs. We again will send out a follow-up email with the link to Jen's PD series, the materials discussed today, including the PowerPoint presentation with links, and also the worksheet and guidance developed by our LEA partners to serve your needs, and additional information about the upcoming series of special education point of contact webinars that we will continue throughout this summer and the next school year. Thank you again. Have a great day.